Why are a greater number of young Latter-day Saint women leaving their faith tradition? Last week, I posted a video on Wednesday about what I call the shrinking Mormon families as a way to talk about changing gender roles to get to this issue. It was based on a New York Times story concerning how Utah fertility rates have dropped 37% in just the last 2 decades. And I place these recent developments within a much longer history dating back to when Mormons used their high fertility rates to emphasize their assimilation into American culture, and then how they bought into the broader culture wars over defending the quote-unquote traditional family despite the growing changes and evolving circumstances in American society. And I emphasize how recent changes in American culture have made it untenable for many women to fill those traditional roles, which has led to a chasm and dissonance, resulting in many women leaving the church. Now, after I recorded my video, but before it was published, the wonderful scholar and journalist Jana Riess published her own essay on this topic that appeared in the Religion News Service and then was aggregated in other publications. It drew from her forthcoming book that she's writing on those who leave the LDS Church, co-authored with Benjamin Knoll, and she summarized that while many factors can be highlighted for why young women are leaving the church, she highlighted the 3 P's. Powerlessness, purity culture, and politics. Now, I really want to dig into these more. I wish I had read the essay before I recorded my video. Just dumb timing made that impossible. So the next best thing is I invited her on for a follow-up chat in this video where we can dig into the topic a bit more, unpack some of the lessons, and learn why this is such a crucial cultural moment for not just Mormonism, but American religion more generally. But before I get to the interview, I have to quickly go through the channel business. If you enjoy this type of historical content where we geek out of the past, make sure you are subscribed. If you want to give back, you can become a member where for a nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get icons next to your name when you leave comments, you can ask questions that I will answer in future mailbag videos, and most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing rigorous scholarship. You can also subscribe to my free Kit newsletter and follow me on my different social media platforms. Links to all of those are found in the video description. But most importantly, I want to do this business because we have a relevant live conversation coming up. I usually do live AMAs the first week of every month. I had to adjust the time due to schedule conflicts, but mark your calendars for Monday, August 31st at 6 p.m. Mountain Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I will be chatting with Dr. Kristen Kobes-Dumais, author of the best-selling book Jesus and John Wayne, whose brand new book, A Cultural History of Live, Laugh, Love, about evangelical women and the world they created. Very thrilled to have her on the channel to chat, so please mark your calendars for Monday, August 31st at 6 p.m. Mountain Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Is going to be a lot of fun. All right, let's get back to today's topic. Dr. Jana Riess is one of the more important voices on modern Mormonism in the public sphere. She received her PhD in American Religious History from Columbia University. She has authored and co-authored a number of important books, my favorite of which is The Next Mormons: How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church, published by Oxford University Press a number of years ago. I kept that book at arm's reach while I was writing my book, American Zion, because it is one of the most important snapshots of an important generation, a hinge point generation in the Mormon tradition. She's also an accomplished journalist. She worked as the religion book review editor for Publishers Weekly for about a decade. She has for a while had a column at the Religion News Service where she keeps the pulse of modern Mormonism, and her work is generally aggregated in many different outlets, including the Salt Lake Tribune, and her opinions are frequently sought for a number of media outlets, including in the last few weeks, as everyone wanted to have her on to talk about this important essay. Her next book is on a very related topic. It's co-authored with their collaborator, Benjamin Knoll, and it's titled Leaving Mormonism: Who is Exiting the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Why? It will be published by Oxford University Press in March next year. It's based on a massive survey data with thousands of survey participants, as well as qualitative interviews that Dr. Riess was a part of. So you should be looking forward to that book. It doesn't have a cover yet, but it's going to be phenomenal. The Oxford University Press already has a page for it. She's also a wonderful friend, and I'm privileged to work with her as along with Dr. Taylor Petrie in running the Eugene, England Summer Institute. So she's a good friend, a brilliant scholar, and a very eloquent spokesperson on these issues. So let's get to my interview with her on the topic of young women leaving the Mormon tradition. We are now fortunate to be joined by the author of the excellent Religion News Service essay and the co-author of the important book coming out on a related topic. So, Jana, thank you so much for joining me today.
Ben, it is a pleasure to see you, as always. Hi.
So let's start broad and then we'll get a bit more narrow. Why, as someone who traces this polling data, explain why it's so significant that we are now at an unprecedented point where men are more likely to identify as religious than women, and women are more likely to leave the faith than men, because that's a major change, right?
Mm-hmm. It is a major change. And before we get to the whys of it, let's just sort of carve out what is happening in the LDS Church and also in American religion more broadly, which is that for decades of survey history, women have polled as being more religious, reliably so. And that has become such a truism, not just for religious people who, are using kind of a gender essentialist ideology to say women are naturally more pious than men, and this is all, sort of spiritually inborn in women and something that men have develop, but also in social scientists, right, who have been used to decades of data that have shown women to be several points more religious, reliably so, than men, and several points less likely to leave religion. So part of the news angle here is just that this is a reversal, and it is particularly happening among younger women. Older women are still, in most surveys, less likely to leave religion than men have been. But for younger women, the script has flipped, and that's a big deal.
Yeah, and you point out, so now getting to the whys, you could point out a number of reasons. You have pointed out a number of reasons in your columns over the years, but in this particular essay, you really crystallize it, I think, quite smartly around the 3 Ps. Can you highlight what those 3 Ps are and why they're so important to understand this dynamic?
Yes, and so there could have been many more Ps. It's been interesting to watch the Facebook and other social media comments on this and saying, why not polygamy? Why not patriarchy? And the short answer to that question is that I was trying to focus on things that are new, either in the LDS Church within these young women's lifetimes or within the culture more broadly. And one of the things that has happened in the culture more broadly is that young women have moved to the left politically. So the first P is politics. And young men have stayed the same or maybe moved a little bit to the left. And it's interesting that young men have had a lot more stability in their political leanings than young women have had. The reason that that is relevant for religion is that politically liberal Americans have been more likely to leave organized religion than politically conservative Americans. And so if we see young women moving to the left politically, that does have ramifications for what's happening with religion. Do you want me to move to the second?
Yeah,
or should we talk about politics?
Just keep moving on. I think, let's meditate on politics for just a moment, because I think it's interesting that that the change is so recent that just a generation ago, women were more likely to be conservative than men, right?
Not necessarily. It depends on the issue.
Right,
yeah, right. But certainly there was a lot more gender parity politically than we're seeing
Yeah.
now. And that's been a
Yeah.
very interesting shift.
Yeah, and maybe part of that is because so many of these young Mormon women are raised in a world where they see what they see value in those progressive politics or liberal politics. That is now the chasm is too large between that and what they're experiencing in the church. Whereas before, they were facing gender inequality everywhere.
Mm.
But now they can see that, well, actually there is something different in the LDS church that might be worth leaving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you've just
Yeah.
hit upon the third P.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Sorry.
we'll skip over number 2 for right now and
Right.
just move to that, because when you said that young women are experiencing gender equality pretty much everywhere in their lives other than the church, I think that is the key. So the third P was powerlessness. And it's not actually that the church has become more conservative about gender roles. If anything, the church has liberalized in key ways. Small steps toward including women in more visible positions, giving women more to do at church. That has trickled down to girls less so, which may be a concern. But powerlessness is a key factor because young women have grown up in a totally different culture than their grandmothers grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And this culture is one that has given them a lot of expectation that they will be equal to boys in every way, and that if they want to run for student council president, nothing's standing in their way. If they want to be CEO of a company, they can do that. If they want to, move into the construction business, they can do that. And so for the church to be holding on to a certain gender essentialist ideology, like I said before, and also teaching that is divinely ordained, teaching that kind of inequality is of God, that really rubs many girls and women the wrong way. And it's the powerlessness issue is also something that I didn't get into, which is that in the original post, when you are equal in other ways in the culture, you have options, right?
Mm.
Leaving religion becomes less stigmatizing when you can compensate for that in all of these other areas of your life. And so for women, there is one sociological theory that essentially says the reason that men have been more likely to leave religion, and white men in particular, is that they have the most cultural power of all, and they can withstand the stigmatization or ostracization that may occur as a result of leaving religion. Whereas women and members of racial minorities have held back from leaving religion, even if perhaps they were harboring doubts, because the stigma would be too much. And so as other things become more equal in the broader culture, it's less dangerous, I would say, for women to leave religion. So that also fits into the powerlessness theorization.
Yeah. And we'll get into some of the ways that the church has been trying to respond to that and how far they're willing to go or whatnot. But now let's go, since I tipped your hat all the way to the third point, let's go to the second P.
Okay, yes, 132. We're back to number 2, which is purity culture. What I was trying to say in the column is that even though Mormonism has emphasized virginity, has emphasized purity really all throughout. If you go back and read some of the Joseph F. Smith things about sexuality, wow, yes, very eye-opening, interesting. Of course, Spencer W. Kimball. So it's not that the purity argument is new, but one of the things that did happen in the late 90s and particularly the early 2000s is this total fixation on modesty rhetoric in the church. And so in the column, I cite one study from Zelophehad's Daughters, where the author went through church magazines from the 1970s up to 2014, and then it has been updated just within the last year to show that there is this spike of gender-specific rhetoric about your body that goes crazy in the early part of this century. And so to the tune of young women hearing 6 times as often that they needed to be concerned about what they were wearing than young men were. And before that, there had been a pretty considerable parity that young men and young women were getting modesty rhetoric at roughly the same rates. And then there's this period where that went through the roof for young women. And we are seeing some of these young women of that age who, in interviews for the Leaving Mormonism book, who in interviews have told me this was definitely a concern for them. It's harder to get at that in survey data. How influenced were you by purity culture? But when they're talking about their lives in these long form interviews, it comes up more often than not that it was really damaging in some ways, even though purity culture also has other aspects that are protective for both young men and young women. Many of these young women felt the damage far more keenly than that protective factor.
Yeah, very well put. So Mormons aren't alone in dealing with this problem. As you mentioned, that there's a larger story going on of religious disaffiliation and gender changes and women identifying more or less religious than men. So in what ways is the Mormon part of the story reflecting these broader trends? And is there any way in which the Mormon part of the story is actually unique?
Great question. In terms of how this is reflecting the broader culture, the politics piece is absolutely reflecting what we're seeing in the culture more broadly. If anything, though, in the LDS context, it's magnified because conservative politicization as an identity has been so emphasized. And so it does make sense that the reaction would be a little bit stronger if the ideology was also stronger. So you see that reflected in some of these women's stories. I think that one of the ways that the LDS Church is a little bit different from what has happened in American religion more generally is that just disaffiliation at all for both men and women is happening later. And for many people, that has been a bit hard to assimilate because we were doing so great. And then suddenly all of these news headlines start coming out about people leaving the church. And for people who were raised on a theology that says that God's blessing has been manifested because we are growing, that's, that does not compute. That doesn't work. And it is also true that right now, even while people are leaving the church, more people are joining the church than has been true in the last decade or so. We definitely see an influx of conversions, even in the United States. And so both of those things are happening simultaneously in a way that some people have a hard time understanding how both of those stories could be true.
It would be really interesting to get the data on those who are joining the church in America to see those trend lines. So maybe that's a future point of study for other Jana Riesses who have more hours in the day.
Yes, it would be others who would pursue that particular study, and I would be cheering them on because I think it's very important. We won't know the long-term impact of the conversions that are happening right now for years. How many of these people have stayed? For example, one of the things that has happened in the cooperative election study data is that we see in the early 2000s, 25 years ago, essentially, that the number that the church says is the number of the percentage of the share of the population of the United States that should be LDS is about 2%. And the church's data has stayed basically the same and has just kept pace with population growth all this time. But according to the CES, the self-identified Latter-day Saints have been dipping and dipping and dipping. And so what happens then, just in last year's data, is that dips below 1% for the first time. They're showing 0.9% self-identified Latter-day Saints in the population, which is half of what the church is showing. So you see the gap gets wider and wider over time. And it will be really interesting, though, to see if that starts turning around as more people convert. Are they staying? Are they having that be a lasting identity?
Right. All right. So the church is clearly aware of these concerns. They have their own studies, in fact, data that I'm sure you and many others would love to get their hands on of affiliation and practice and activity level. So in what ways has the church responded to this issue of young women leaving the faith in higher numbers? Practical implications or maybe some ideological shifts? How is the church trying to solve this problem?
Yeah, there have been a number of attempts to solve this, the most dramatic of which is lowering the missionary age for young women so that now both young women and young men can serve a mission at age 18. And that I think is great. I actually saw that happen in my stake, where at our stake conference last year, late last year, one of the young women was the speaker, youth speaker, and she basically said, I was thinking about leaving the church, and I had a lot of questions, and I just couldn't seem to get answers to them. And then the church lowered the missionary age, and now I'm going to go on a mission. And so she was about to leave for the MTC, and I was sitting there thinking, as a researcher, aha, the church, it's working for at least this one young woman. That policy change probably kept her in the church at least a little bit longer. And if you can get them to serve a mission, the chances of that adult identity being more lasting are much higher than if they just simply drift away after high school. When we saw the young men's missionary age lowered down to 18 and young women's to 19, that came right after or just a couple of years after, there was a meeting of the brethren, and you can watch this on YouTube. It was leaked by Mormon leaks, and they're discussing the terrible problem of young adult retention around the world, and particularly how young men, as they say, just fall off a cliff if we can't keep them after high school. They just fall off a cliff if they don't go on a mission. So a couple of years later, you see the missionary age change. And I really do think that this is very similarly motivated policy change, because they're now seeing that problem with young women.
Yeah. So, and there have been other steps that have taken, whether it be softening the temple rituals to have more gender equality, allowing women to serve in more leadership positions like Sunday school president. But my question to you, and feel free to dodge this question because I know this goes beyond the scholarly analysis to more prediction, do you think that there are enough changes that can be done within the patriarchal system, short of priesthood ordination, that is going to stem this flow? Or is it just kind of rearranging small particulars where the big elephant in the room still remains?
I don't have an answer to that. We have a number of examples of other religions that have liberalized, that have struggled. It's not a simple case in which people leave a conservative religion because, for example, they disagree with its stance on same-sex marriage, and then they go and join an LGBTQ affirming church. That in fact, they're more likely to leave religion than they are to join another religion, another church. And so I don't know that simply liberalizing policies for young women would be enough in this cultural climate that we're having right now to keep religion, or to keep young women in the religious fold. It would possibly help, but this is what happens. I mentioned the 0.9% share of the population. That was one study. Other studies have shown it a little bit higher. Pew's is a little higher. PRRI's is a little higher. But let's just say you're between 1 and 1.5% of the population in the United States now. You cannot help but be affected by all the other winds of change that are happening around you. Your kids are generally not going to be raised in a complete bubble where they are away from social media, where they are attending homeschool or a really conservative private school. You're going to be affected by what's going on in the culture. And so it's really tough to resist that. And another thing that happens is that when more people leave religion, more people leave religion, by which I mean, when it becomes more socially acceptable to leave religion, more people are going to do it. And that's true of high demand religions, perhaps in particular.
All right. So you've been working with your collaborator, Benjamin Knoll, for several years on a book that is seeing the light of day next March, Leaving Mormonism, Who is Exiting the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Why. So you've been thinking about this general, not just young women, but the general demographic of people who leave the LDS church. So we're going to close on kind of a broader question that stems from that research, which is, what would you say are some of the most common misconceptions about this group of those who leave the church?
That they got offended, that they wanted to go out and have sex and get drunk. Most of the people are very thoughtful who leave the church. And They have a lot of stories to tell about their upbringing, about their decisions, and about how those decisions to stay or leave religion affected their family relationships. You know, Benjamin Knoll, my research partner, he is the quantitative data research partner. I'm the qualitative person, which means that I do the oral history interviews, and I interviewed more than 100 people who had either left Mormonism in the United States or who had experienced some kind of faith crisis and decided to stay. I thought it was very important to include those people in the book as well. And the factors that we talked about, especially politics, certainly play a role, but it's always wound up with very complex views about God, about family, and the role of religion more generally. You know, one of the things that I wonder about as a researcher is how much a high demand religion that really doesn't have a category for the C and E people. My husband is Episcopalian, and they have the C and E people, who are the people who come on Christmas and come on Easter. And you don't really see them at other times unless someone is being hatched, matched, or dispatched. So if it's a birth, a wedding, or a funeral, they might be in church. Christmas and Easter, they might be in church. Otherwise, they're not in church. We don't have any sort of category for that in the LDS tradition. And I'm not saying we should have that category, but what happens, though, is that a binary system exists in which some of those people who might have stayed on the margins, or at least ticked the box on a survey that said, I identify as a Latter-day Saint, feel kind of pushed out because they're not going to meet that bar. They're not going to be able to live that kind of life. And so one of the things that I wonder about as a researcher is what would happen if that category did exist. You know, what if we had a halfway covenant, essentially, historically, for Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, very fascinating. Well, Jana Riess, author of the excellent essay in Religion News Service that I will link to in the video description, people can go check out, and also co-author of the forthcoming book, Leaving Mormonism, coming from Oxford University Press in March 2027. Jana, thank you so much for spending some time with me.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you.
Thanks again to Dr. Riess for spending some time with me, answering my questions, and just producing important work that helps us make sense of the current moment. It's difficult to overstate how much thought Jana puts into these topics. She's always so calculated and measured and places these things within context. She is not rushing to judgment, which is why her ideas are so important and influential. If you haven't yet, if you're one of the few people who haven't read her essay, go do so now. It's linked in the video description. And look forward to her book, Leaving Mormonism, which is coming out with Oxford next March. It's going to be fantastic, and I'm sure I'll have her on as well as her co-author to discuss the book as its release approaches. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it added more context to these broader discussions. It's important to take these recent developments and place it not just in the broader contextual analysis of what's going on in American society, but also in the longer historical tradition. And this video, as well as my video last Wednesday, aimed to do that. History has never been more relevant than it is today, which is why I believe these conversations are important. So if you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, share the video so we can expand the conversation, subscribe to the channel so you can not miss anything, and become a member if you want to give back. These conversations give context to our world and help us understand how we got here and where we might be going.